Good morning, I'm Rosemary Agnew. I'm not quite sure if I'm the Ombudsman or the INWO today. I think I'm both. I've declined so far to put everything on a business card, partly because I don't go anywhere to give anybody a business card anymore, and partly because there's only so many words you can get on those little bits of paper. Just for the day, if you can keep yourself muted when you're not speaking, feel free to keep your video camera on or off. I know for myself, I have to periodically turn the camera off because it improves the sound quality. Ideally, it would be better if videos were off during the presentation, but don't worry too much about that. We are going to have questions at the end. So someone can't hear me. Helen and Emma and others can. Can everybody else hear me? How do you switch off video? At the bottom of the screen there should be a number of buttons. It's the second one in from the left that says stop video. I'm going to carry on. Emma and Helen seem to be having a conversation about how they might get their sound on. We're going to have questions at the end, so we'd appreciate if during the presentations themselves you either just make a note of it for the end or just pop them into chat and we'll try and pick them all up. If there are any we don't get round to today, we will do our best to get back to you after the event with any responses. And do feel free to use the chat to chat amongst yourselves as well. There's also the reactions button at the bottom of the screen. So if you particularly like something or want to wave at us or what have you, very welcome to do that. So what's today going to look like? We can just move to the next slide. This is a summary of what we're going to be running through today. The session really came about because of a number of questions we had about the role of confidential contact and what we would expect a confidential contact to be doing under the standards. We're going to illustrate this by using a scenario and just run through some of the do's and don'ts. But particularly important, I think, is how organisations support confidential contacts. And then again, we've had a few questions about the relationship between primary care. So hopefully that will cover everything at the end. If you do have any feedback for us, we'd be very grateful to receive it. And if there are a number of questions that you think would benefit from being added to our FAQs, please also let us know. Now, at this point, I'm going to ask Francesca, her Sunday name, Fran to the rest of us, and Mike to just introduce themselves, and I will hand over to them to carry on with the rest of the session. Thanks, Fran.
Hi everyone, I'm Fran Richards. I'm the team manager of the INWO team, and I'll be taking you through some of the presentation, kindly helped by my colleague Mike. Are you there, Mike? I can't see you on my screen just now.
Hi, yes, I'm here. Morning, everybody. I'm Mike Colmyard. I'm one of the complaints reviewers in the team. One of 4 complaints reviewers. The other ones are Amy, Edward, and Oliver.
So thank you, Mike. I'll pick up the presentation from here. The first thing we're going to look at is what the standards say about the role of the confidential contact. They set out a range of expectations about the role, which go well beyond providing a first point of contact. But this first point of contact is the most important part of the confidential contact role, I think it's fair to say. The standards set out what's expected in that first contact. Most importantly, it's about providing a safe space for the person to raise their concern so they can share their concern and explore their options in a safe way about what they can do next, where they could take it, it may be that whistleblowing is the right route, but it may not always be. So the confidential contact should be able to provide advice and assistance to steer the whistleblower or potential whistleblower through either what the whistleblowing standards would mean, or if another route is more appropriate for them, such as an HR process or a professional regulator like the GMC, for instance, what their options are in that way. The standards are also clear that the confidential contact should be separate from a whistleblower's line management structures where possible. And that's because they can always go to their line manager if they want to. But it's often useful to have someone that's not within that structure that can provide support from a more independent perspective. And they should certainly not be involved in managing the whistleblowing process. And I'll come back to that in a bit. So this may mean it's necessary to have more than one confidential contact within a board or organisation, especially if you've got a fairly large organisation. We'd expect it to be helpful to have more than one. They also have a role in promoting speaking up in a more general sense, to make sure people are aware of who they as confidential contacts are and what they do, the benefits of raising concerns and the routes for doing that within their board. The confidential contact needs to be able to work with senior management and frontline staff so that they can kind of get that message across that it's safe to raise concerns, and also to highlight areas where they see barriers to speaking up. So and it is this feedback role for management and for those people managing the whistleblowing process in particular, that they're kind of eyes and ears on the ground, that make confidential contacts a really important asset for organisations, to hear about how easy staff find it to raise concerns and how likely they are to come across barriers in any particular situation. They're likely, the confidential contacts, to have really helpful ideas about how to resolve those barriers too. So it's really helpful for an organisation to get feedback on the application of the standards and how it's going from their confidential contacts. I'll now pass over to Mike for the next slide.
Thanks, Fran. Okay, so at this stage, we're going to get slightly interactive. In a minute, I'm going to ask you to put some answers into the chat function, so if you could have that open. What we're going to look at is a wee scenario that we came up with, probably not too uncommon actually. I'll give you the background to it. So there's a nurse who's concerned that the PPE that they're using doesn't meet the requirements, and this leaves them and patients at risk of infection. They've raised concerns in the past about other areas of clinical practice with this line manager. They feel that the relationship isn't going well. It's become very strained because of the past instances of raising concerns. The nurse reports that they've been singled out for criticism by the manager. There's no trust between them at all. So perhaps not unsurprisingly, they approach the confidential contact for advice. And they tell them about the PPE situation and also about the concerns that their line manager is treating them unfairly. So, putting yourself in the position of the confidential contact, what are your next steps in this scenario? Not looking for you to get into the nitty-gritty of the PPE or anything like that. It's just, what are your actions? So just comments, one line, into the chat box, if you could, please. I'll give you a minute to put some answers in, and then we'll go and review them. Starting now. That's brilliant, everybody. Thanks for those answers already. So some good answers there. So let's have a quick look at what people have said. So arrange a meeting with the whistleblower. Absolutely. You'd want to find out what's been going on. Look to discuss with the next line manager or a speak up advocate. Yeah, potentially, but I think you'd want to sort of find out first of all what's going on and explore the issue. So this issue was picked up in the ethical advice support group. Yes, it looks like it's cross-cutting. So make contact with the relevant manager to let them know a concern has been raised. I think we'll come on to that in a minute, which manager you'd want to raise that with. Have a chat to the confidential contact. That's you in this particular role, and see if they've pursued the business as usual channels. Yeah, we'll talk about that in a minute. Have conversations with the individual explaining the whistleblowing process and protections. Yes, that's very valuable, and the person would benefit from that. Review existing mechanisms for raising concerns. Share with the staff member to consider next steps. Perhaps that's going a bit too far into the future. We're just trying to find out the issues at this stage. Listen carefully to the concerns raised by a staff member so that the concern is accurately captured. Brilliant, good answer. Find out what infection control advice for the level of PPE required for the situation and what PPE has been given to staff. That's actually a wee bit technical here. Your role as the confidential contact here is to facilitate the person in making the concern known. So you would give them advice and you would support them to make the concern known to the relevant manager. So perhaps this is getting a bit into the investigation side of things. Listen to the staff member, recognise the concerns and present options on how to proceed. Yep, that's a great answer. Ask who they've discussed with this. Have they spoken to the line manager's manager? Do they have a union? How are they in themselves? All good points. The support side of things indeed could come from the union. You'd also want to know how exactly they are feeling and reassure them, and provide support or point them to support that they need. I would meet and suggest raising the specific issue through usual channels first and writing an email. I think in this scenario that the person has tried to raise things before and it has gone wrong. So I think that's why they've come to the confidential contact. Listen, absolutely. Ask the whistleblower what outcome they're looking for. Indeed. Meet the person and establish the facts. Yep. Ask if they have evidence and encourage them to keep it. That's helpful. To thank them for sharing their concern and ask them what outcome they're looking for. Yes, we have a thank you. That's great. On our slide, as you'll see, what should the confidential contact do? We have our ideas presented there, and the first one is thank them and reassure. Arrange to walk through and explain the role of the confidential contact, ask what the person wants to happen, talk through options, explain standards and processes. Yep, this is all very good. So we're definitely going down the right lines here. So thanks for all your answers. I'm just going to briefly cover off here what we had put down as well. So first of all, obviously you want to thank them, as somebody said already. You want to reassure the person that they've done the right thing. And that's very important for somebody who's coming forward with a concern, that they feel reassured, because it's a big thing that they're doing, and you know, people can really feel quite frightened and scared by it. So you give the person a safe space. I think that was said. So this is a space to talk about the issues that they're concerned about and listen to their story. And again, that was picked up in your comments as well. So thank you for that. One of the things that I'm not quite sure was mentioned, but we did talk about exploring, and that's identifying whether it's appropriate for whistleblowing. Now, as a confidential contact, you're not expected to be a gatekeeper. It's up to whoever deals with the concern to make a final decision about whether it meets the definition or not. But you can certainly give advice. And in this particular scenario, remember that there's HR issues mixed up within it. So you may find that some of the issues are more appropriate for HR, and you'd want to signpost those issues to HR, you know, either to the grievance policy or the bullying and harassment procedures as well. So that's something to think about, is identifying the whistleblowing issues and separating out the HR ones and referring accordingly. So if the issues are more suitable for whistleblowing, then you would discuss whether they would use a business as usual process. I think somebody mentioned that in the comments again. Now, business as usual could be logging it on Datex, but in this case, because there has been past issues, you maybe want to be thinking about logging it as a concern under the whistleblowing procedure. You have to have these sort of considerations in your head, whether to use business as usual or whistleblowing, and you would need to think about things like, obviously how serious the issue is, whether it can actually be resolved under business as usual, and the relationships with the managers concerned. So in this case, it's likely that whistleblowing procedure would be better. A question you might want to think about, actually, Fran was reminding me of this yesterday, was what you should do actually if the person says they want to whistleblow, even if you think business as usual is more appropriate. And perhaps we'll come back to that at the end in your questions. So after you've done all that process, you would obviously think about sharing the information with the appropriate manager. So in this case, it's unlikely that the line manager is going to be the appropriate manager. You would need to have somebody who was going to look into this and could deal with the the PPE side of things. And obviously you would get the person's permission to speak to this other manager as well. And the last thing you'd want to do is potentially log the concern or signpost them to someone else who can. It's important that it's logged, especially if the person actually wants to whistleblow. Okay. And at this stage, I'll hand back to Fran.
Thanks very much, Mike. I hope that gave you an idea of what our expectations are of that first initial contact with the whistleblower. I thought it would also be useful to run through a couple of things that we think it would be appropriate for the confidential contact not to get involved in. And it's important, we think, that they shouldn't be making definitive decisions as to whether someone or something is whistleblowing or not. This is a decision for the organisation to make, and their official representative should be the one that's writing that up and signing it off. And that's particularly the case if someone, is clear that what they want to do is whistleblow. That as a confidential contact, as Mike mentioned, you shouldn't be gatekeeping. So it's not your role to be saying no to someone if what they want to do is raise a concern under the standards. And if the organisation feels it's not whistleblowing, then that's fine. We would support them in making a decision that something doesn't fit the definition of whistleblowing in the standards. They need to put that in writing and signpost to the INWO to us. And we can then review that decision. And that gives people the confidence that if they want to whistleblow, they can't be told they can't unless there's good reason for that, unless it doesn't meet the definition of whistleblowing that we're using in the standards. So it means that there's an alternative route for that decision. It's also not the confidential contact's role to start to investigate the case. As we're saying, their role is really supportive, and starting an investigation kind of muddy the waters with that support role. That's why we would say that they shouldn't be part of the management process for whistleblowing and if possible for a specific investigation as well. They need to kind of stay at arm's length from that investigation so they can be supportive of the individual without prejudice, without any involvement in that case. In terms of updating the whistleblower, that would normally be done by an investigator or the person managing the process. Especially if it's at stage 2 and there are kind of ongoing updates that need to be shared. But in some instances, it may be appropriate for the confidential contact to take this role if the person's feeling particularly vulnerable and if the confidential contact was one of the few people they trust and can happily access support from. So I think they may also want to be copied into updates so that they can be aware of when support might be needed. But that's really a kind of to be discussed on a case-by-case basis to decide with the whistleblower what they want and what's going to be most helpful for them. But one of the important things is to have some independence from the investigating of the concern, as I mentioned, so that support can be provided on a more impartial basis. And looking at what we were talking about, mentioned earlier about confidential contacts and management, we've had a few people ask a question of whether the confidential contact should be a manager or not. And the answer is they can be, but they don't have to be, in a rather frustratingly vague way. So I'll try and give a bit of explanation to that. The confidential contact could be at any level, any management level within the structure of the organisation. The only requirement is that they don't manage the whistleblowing process. It would be very difficult for them to fulfil their kind of support independence role if they are also managing the process. It's helpful for them to be able to have some level of independence from the organisation in terms of their role. So, and that may mean, for instance, not being part of the executive function, so they can support the individual and not be drawn into the rights and wrongs of the concern itself. And that assists in maintaining trust in the individual and the advice and support they're giving. As we mentioned before, big organisations or boards would probably benefit from having 2 or more confidential contacts, potentially with different backgrounds, so that staff from different areas of an organisation can empathise with, feel that person was more likely to be able to empathise with their situation, and also so that there's someone with suitable independence from the situation. Having options for staff will help to provide confidence in the process that there's a range of different avenues available to them for raising concerns in a way that is appropriate for their situation. But whatever the level of management their confidential contact has, they need to have the confidence to speak to managers themselves, to promote the role of the confidential contact, so that staff at every level can gain an awareness of who the confidential contact is and what their role is. They need to promote speaking up, as we mentioned before, to raise the profile and the trust in the process. So they need to have the confidence to speak to management, even if they aren't within the management structure themselves. I'll now pass on to back to Mike to have another look at that scenario we were talking about earlier.
Great, thanks, Fran. Okay, time to get interactive again. So just a reminder of where we're at with our scenario. We've got a concern about inadequate PPE, patients and staff are at risk. There's been previous issues, speaking to the manager, and on the face of it, there is a whistleblowing issue to consider. So again, in your role as a confidential contact, let's place ourselves there. Think about in particular, what do you need from your organisation at this point in order to carry out your role? So same as before, you've got 1 minute to jot down some ideas into the chat box, and then we'll review them. So go now. There's some excellent answers here and a few themes coming through already. One being protected time, and the other being training coming up quite a lot, and support and peer support as well from other confidential contacts. So yeah, this is very interesting. I will go through some of these answers here and let's see what we come up with. So as we're saying, protected time, empowerment, yeah. In terms of your role is to move people to the right parties who can actually investigate the concerns. So I'd be interested to discuss empowerment actually and see how much empowerment you need in this particular scenario. Need a system to document this is a concern, absolutely, and the routes of support. Yep, protected time, training, support and advice, clarity on the process. That's an interesting comment, and be happy to discuss that at the end as well if you feel there's not enough clarity in the process that is in the standards. Training and support, again, mandatory Learn Pro for the whistleblowing modules. There's not enough awareness and still a lot of stigma. Yes, absolutely. The modules are there on the TURIS website just now, and still being used quite regularly, but maybe not enough usage so far. Reassurance that senior management is willing to listen and act, absolutely. Clear lines of communication and support, yes. Visible and accessible, appropriate support and accurate information, training. Yeah, so as we were saying, quite a few themes. Trust is a good comment as well. Need to know how the organisation is structured so that they can signpost to the right people. I think that's a feeling that we have as well in the INWO, that you know, we're looking at organisations and trying to work out who are the important key people. Clear guidance and support, yes. Cooperation, information on what has happened previously and time to deal with the issue, background, good stuff. I'm just going to be selective now because some of these are quite similar. Staff to recognise, trust and have confidence in you carrying out the role. Absolutely. Someone to log the concern. Yeah. So quite a few comments about logging the concern and having an appropriate system for it. Again, that's something we might want to come back to at the end of the session if you feel that's not there. Lots of comments about support and time and guidance. Okay, and signposting options. Right, if we could move on to the next slide. This is very interesting because on our last exercise, obviously, there was quite a lot of convergence, but we seem to be talking about different things and different needs with this particular one. So our thoughts on it were that obviously you would need support, which is mentioned in quite a few places. A culture that values concerns. So in other words, a culture that sees concerns as an opportunity for learning and improvement. People that listen and respond when concerns are raised and react promptly. Effective management of the process. So you as a confidential contact shouldn't have to be coordinating the whistleblowing process in addition to your role. You need somebody to take that on. Honesty from the organisation about what an investigation identifies. Implementation of any recommendations. That's certainly something that the INWO will be following up on. And above all, support for doing the job, because it's not easy. So that's what we had, but happy to talk about any of the issues that you've raised in the chat at the end. And with that, I'll hand back to Fran.
Thanks, Mike. So I'm going to pick up on that from Mike on that. And thanks very much for your input there. It's all very interesting to see that the varying views there. I thought it would be useful to look at confidential contacts for primary care and contractors, because I know that's an issue that's been raised with us in the past, and I know some of the confidential contacts also cover primary care. So what will we be expecting of that, and how do we think that should be managed? So boards are required to have confidential contacts for primary care, so they can provide a point of contact for staff, particularly in small primary care providers who would otherwise find it difficult to raise a concern safely or need or access that support. Boards may also need to follow up on a concern. That doesn't necessarily mean they're going to investigate it, but they would maybe want to know that there's a concern out there about in relation to that primary care provider, and have a role in either overseeing or receiving a report following an investigation to make sure that they're aware of the issues that are being raised in that provider. The confidential contact for primary care can provide obviously advice and support, just like any other confidential contact that works for the board, but they should be mindful that primary care providers are independent employers and that they won't have the same HR policies. Primary care staff may also feel that their identity is more easily exposed being in a small organisation, and that their job is potentially less secure. They're not in, a big private public sector organisation like the NHS, and that can feel like it's a less secure place to be. So if you are a primary care confidential contact, it might be worth being aware of the advice that ACAS have available on their website. They've got an excellent resource available to you there with masses of information and advice on HR policies and practice. And so that's certainly somewhere we go when we're looking into HR policies and processes that we think should be applicable in a particular situation. So that's a little bit, I know it's not much detail, but a very short review of the primary care confidential contact role. I'll now pass back to Mike briefly, who will look at that scenario in a primary care context.
Okay, so we're just going to change the scenario up a wee bit. So you remember the scenario is about inadequate PPE and risk to patients and staff. So now let's add a complication that the nurse works in a GP practice and you are the board's primary care confidential contact. So is there going to be anything different about the actions you would take from the first time we discussed this, the advice you would give, and who would you speak to about investigating the concern? So again, 1 minute, if you can put your answers into the chat, and we'll have a quick review after that. And go now. Okay, thanks everyone. We're getting some good answers coming in here. Just going to the top of the answers that we've had. So we had liaise with the business manager of the practice. The advice shouldn't, don't think the advice should be different. Manage these situations the same in each setting. So that seems to be a repeated theme. So a lot of people think the advice and the actions would be the same reassurance about anonymity and no detriment. Somebody said the investigator should clearly be someone outside primary care. We'll come on to that in a minute. somebody's not sure about the investigator, but would still want to meet with the staff member. Advice may differ depending on who to signpost to within the GP practice and who could then investigate independently. I think that's a good succinct answer of the situation. No difference again. Okay, arrange a meeting to gather information, reassure the staff of confidentiality, contact the business manager, re-investigating the concern. All actions would be the same, the advice would be the same. Okay, if we could move on to the next slide. So here's our thoughts. Yeah, we would agree a lot of the actions don't change. So again, at the start, you would thank and reassure the staff member for raising a concern. You'd provide a safe space and listen to the story. So these are all things that you know, we did before. You would help still to identify whether it's a whistleblowing issue and whether to go down the business as usual route or straight into the two-step procedure, depending on the situation and the seriousness of it and who's involved. And you would also, I think, as everybody said, the standards apply just as much in primary care, so the person can still have the same expectations, so you would discuss those expectations with them. And that's no different to how you would discuss it with somebody in your own board. Where things might be different and where your advice might be different is on the HR side of things. So the GP practice might have its own HR policies and procedures, which will hopefully cover grievance and bullying and harassment, but you wouldn't be able to assume that they're the same as you would have in a board. So you would possibly need to direct the person to go and find out what these policies are. As to who you would share information with, I think that's a slightly more tricky situation. I think somebody had said in the comments that you would investigate it completely outside of primary care. Other people have said we could go to the business manager. It really depends with primary care on the size of the practice, for example, who's involved. So if it's the senior management are involved, that could cause an issue. So it could be that the board would investigate the concern, your board, or if it's possible and the issues don't constrict you from doing that, then it could be also investigated locally. And at the end of the day, local solutions are best for local problems, and the staff member can be supported better if it's done locally. But you would have to sort of weigh all these issues up as to how safe it is for them to go through the process locally. So that's the scenario. So I'm going to hand back to Fran.
Thanks, Mike. So I just thought, coming to the end of our presentation, I would run through the various different ways we can assist, what the support the INWO can give you, either as a confidential contact or someone that's involved in the whistleblowing process. So our advice line, which you hopefully will be familiar with how to access at least. If you're a confidential contact phoning for advice on behalf of a whistleblower, we'd be happy to talk through their options and what advice you could give them. And that will be our 0800 number, which you can find on our website with the times that that's running. It runs kind of half of each day. If you are managing the whistleblowing process and have an inquiry about how the standards apply in a particular situation, how you should handle a case, the SPSO standards team are better placed to provide general advice about the application of the standards in a specific context. And we do it that way to avoid any conflicts of interest in our decision making on a complaint that may later end up coming to the INWO. We're happy to provide whatever support for implementation boards would find useful. We can share that you can share your ideas with us and we'll give you feedback. You can ask us any questions, you can ask for assistance. Plenty of boards have been to us already, and I think we're mostly pretty friendly, I think. CHURAS training modules are obviously there and available for staff. We really encourage as many managers to review those. module for those receiving concerns, and obviously confidential contacts, that'd be really important for yourselves, but managers in general would benefit from it. It might take longer than you'd like. It's 2 to 3 hours, but it's worth it to get a really good feel for what is expected of you in your role as a confidential contact and as a manager. Our bulletins come out once a month and provide a taste of what we've been doing and provide top tips on implementing the standards. When we start reporting on cases that we've investigated, we'll also be sharing the findings there too. And this is where we share updates on our website and resources and promote things like this webinar. And speaking of which, the next webinar on good practice in receiving concerns is on the 29th of September. If you're interested in coming along to that, please just email us at the usual email address, and we'd be very happy to see you coming along for that in session 2. There will be a little bit of overlap with this one, as you can imagine, but there'll also be other things involved too. Thanks very much for participating so effectively in the chat too. That's been really, really helpful, and I hope it's created a slightly more lively session. So thanks very much, and we look forward to seeing some or all of you at the session at the end of September as well.